Hi, this is Hyperwave. I'm Leah Wald here with Tyler Jenks. This is going to be a fun one. Dow's down, but we're going to talk about some fun stuff. So as we've mentioned before that we were going to do this episode, we're going to be talking about altcoins and if they're not in hyperwaves. As Tyler and I tweeted out this morning, they are potentially in a phase 2. They are not in a phase 3. And GBTC is also potentially in a phase 2. So, and also, as we've mentioned before, that we see Bitcoin as a very interesting asset class with the altcoins as sub-assets under the major asset class of Bitcoin. So today is going to be fun. Tyler is going to give us another precursor of hyperwaves and then explain what's going on with altcoins and how we should view them in light of hyperwave. So Tyler. Oh, and always we will end with Bitcoin price action because we know you guys always want to know that too. So Tyler.
Great. Thank you, Leah. We've been getting a lot of very interesting questions and comments about some of the statements I've been making about the cryptos. And there has been a lot of misunderstanding. Anybody listening to this, you either came onto our channel very early, in which we spent about 10 or 15 podcasts explaining step by step what a hyperwave is. So anyone that did not see all of those is sort of coming in on the middle. And that would be fine, except things are happening so fast in the stock market, the NASDAQ market, the crypto market, that we're having to throw concepts around that are getting jumbled in a lot of people's minds, including people that have been with us for a long time, because of answers I'm giving to questions that I'm assuming are coming from people that don't have the background in asking those. And I'm trying to be as careful as I can. So
Tyler, we lost you for a second. Not yet, but I'll let you know when you're able to come back on. Hello, everybody. All right, we're gonna lose Tyler for 1 second, but we're gonna get him back right away. Welcome from North Carolina. I will give you guys a little I spy with my little eye. Do you guys see Thor somewhere? The question. Sleeping puppy. Cool. Yes, Dow is absolutely down. We're going to pull up a chart of the Dow. And here comes Tyler again.
okay.
Sorry.
How's that?
Much better. You're back.
Okay, very good. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what I originally called the archetype hyperwave. We'll look at a chart of that so I can go over what it means to go from phase 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, and who does it and who doesn't do it and why and all that sort of stuff. Then we're going to take a look at the Bitcoin hyperwave because it's almost perfect with a couple of little exceptions. Then we're going to look at the old NASDAQ hyperwave from 1992 through 2003, not the new one, the old one, because it was as perfect a hyperwave as I have seen out of now close to 450 different examples we've been looking at. Then I'm going to look at Apple hyperwave one more time, so you'll have a very clear idea of what a hyperwave looks like. And then we're going to go through the 10 largest altcoins by cap size, one by one, and I'll explain why they are not in hyperwaves. Now, that does not mean that they won't be in a hyperwave in the future, but they are not now. So I will go to screen share and we will start with the real basic, and I will try to go through it as quickly as I can. This is a hyperwave. This is a perfect hyperwave. And what you don't have and should understand, because it speaks directly to the crypto space. The distance of this on the bottom is in years, not in months, and definitely not in weeks. This number one has got to be at least 2 to 3 years long, and in many cases is 5 to 20 years long. The number two has got to be a sharp move up from the number one. And for those that don't remember, there are two colors on this chart which are a little difficult to see, but there's a red 1, a red 5, and a red 7. There's a green 2, 3, 4, and 6. The 2, 3, 4, and 6 are up waves. The 5 and the 7 is a down wave, but I include 1 as a down wave because 1, 5, and 7 means the price stays below the line. Always below the line. In 7, when we finally go down to the bottom, we will be below this line. 2, 3, 4, and 6, the price is always above the line and never breaks it on a weekly closing basis. Okay, that's a hyperwave. Number one, it's years long. Number two, there's always 7 phases. Number three, any stock, bond, commodity, rare coin, Chinese ceramics, painting, real estate, thoroughbred racehorse, the price of those, if they are going flat or sideways for a period of years, that is called phase 1 of a hyperwave. But I don't call it a hyperwave until it gets to phase 3. I use the terminology phase 1 and 2 because you can't get to 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 unless you go through 1 and 2. So just because I say that Monero is in a phase 2 hyperwave is a bit of a misstatement on my part, but that's only if you haven't listened to what we've talked about for the last couple of months. You need to move from a 2 to a 3 to be in a hyperwave. Why? Because only 1 out of 1,000 of all the things I just mentioned, asset classes that is in this phase 1 period going flat, ever becomes a hyperwave. So you basically can forget it. Just because something's going sideways doesn't mean it's going to ever be in a hyperwave. But there's a big jump when you move to a phase 2. And just think about fundamentally and technically what we're saying here. For years, something has not been able to increase in price, and all of a sudden, it does increase in price. There's got to be fundamental and technical supply-demand relationships about that. So phase 2 is simply a building block in what's going to be an enormous building. But it's still not enough because only 1 out of 4 things that go from 1 to 2 ever become a hyperwave. So only 25%. So if we've got 1,000 cryptos that are in phase 2s, none of which have entered phase 3s, none of them are in a hyperwave. But some of them, and if I use that 1 out of 4, 250 of them might very well at some point enter a phase 3. Now, this is where I start calling something a hyperwave. Otherwise, it's just a waste of everybody's oxygen to go around running around talking about things that are in phase 2 because you don't know what it's going to do. It could very easily break the phase 2 line, go back to phase 1, go out of business. But once you get to a phase 3, 85% of them, 85 out of 100, 850 out of 1,000, of those that enter a phase 3 are going to continue all the way through the hyperwave, 4, 5, 6, and 7. That's why when I'm looking at charts, I'm not interested in things in 1 or 2. I want at least the probability on my sides that we're looking at a real hyperwave. Now, if we went from a 1 that lasted 3 months and a 2 that lasted 4 months and a 3 that lasted 4 months, I'm not interested. That's not a hyperwave. That's something else. It's probably a bubble, and it could go up more. It could burst. It could fall down. I don't care. That's not a hyperwave. Hyperwaves, in terms of the fundamental definition of them, are things that are changing the world macro financial landscape. And you don't do that with an individual stock. Back in the 1920s, I've shown everybody that have looked at the earlier lessons on Hyperwave, maybe 25 or 30 examples of stocks that were in hyperwaves in the 1920s before the crash of 29 and the depression that lasted for 5 or 6 years. But that depression didn't come about because one of those stocks was in a hyperwave. It's just that the entire Dow Jones Industrial Average was in a hyperwave. The entire financial structure of the US was in a hyperwave. And yes, there were some hangers-on individual stocks that were also in hyperwaves, but only because this major, massive shift was taking place with all equities in the US market. And by the way, also almost all major indexes around the world. That's what a hyperwave is. It's looking at gold and silver when we go off of the gold standard. It's looking at the NASDAQ where telecommunications is beginning to grow so quickly and technology is growing so quickly that hundreds and hundreds of stocks and the index itself enters a hyperwave, saying this is a fundamental shift in the culture of the world. Okay, with that backdrop, let's look at the ones we've talked about. We've looked at this one, which is the hyperwave in Bitcoin. It's gone on for 10 years. The reason I identified it last year, back around here, which was the end of summer, was because this particular hyperwave had previous mini fractal hyperwaves back in its history. And I knew what the Dow Jones Industrial had shown me, that if you get something that has already shown the signs of being able to build a hyperwave that went from basically 10 cents to $1,000 in a short number of years, and it was changing the landscape in terms of possibly the financial world, in terms of replacing fiat money. At this point, I realized that as I could draw a phase 2 line, and then it shifted into a phase 3 line after SegWit August the 1st, and into some other fundamental things that were happening towards the end of the year, I was able to draw a phase 3 trend line. And this trend line I drew long before we got up to the top and came back, and now I've tested it over and over again. So that's the only reason I put Bitcoin into this class. Now, we will have to see if I overstepped my bounds by interpreting this particular asset as something that has the potential to shift world thinking. I don't believe so, but if this drops below phase 3, comes down to 4,000, which is where phase 2 is, breaks below that, drops back below 1,000, first of all, I'm going to assure everybody that every other crypto is going to do the same thing. Now we're all going to be sitting looking at all cryptos, including Bitcoin, that have basically gone back to the beginning point, and we're going to have to ask the fundamental question, is this thing over? I am far away from doing that. And this Sunday will be a test, once again, of the phase 3 line. Okay, enough of that. I'm going to jump into a couple of other charts. I think this is one of them, which is Apple. Here's why I say Apple is, even though it's part of a NASDAQ, which we've already looked at and know that it's in a hyperwave, Apple has been doing this thing for years. It's taken years to build a phase 1, years to build a phase 2, years to build a phase 3, and now this phase 4. When we look at a chart like, let's try this one. This is a perfect hyperwave for the NASDAQ, but it's not where we are now. This is back in 1992, 93, 94, 95, all the way to the peak in 2000, all the way back down in 2003. It goes on for years. Each of the phases go on for years. And just as I began to say, what's happening, I'm not an architectural engineer, but what you're seeing here is building blocks by these phase lines that are, if they go on long enough, have the ability to support further growth at accelerated angles. And it takes that architecture to be able to support these tremendous price increases in 3 and 4. And one of the things I mentioned about Bitcoin was the fact that it had this kind of activity in its early years before dropping all the way back, never down to 10 cents again, but down to 1,000 or 500 or 200, and then beginning another series of building blocks, which we have seen at this end of the NASDAQ as we have now gone into higher and higher prices. Okay, let's look at the cryptos. And we're going to do this in the order of the capitalization of these cryptos, going from the biggest to the smallest. Bitcoin is the biggest. The most recent thing I show on it is 140 billion, but it's been up as high as 300 and some before this big drop, but it's still number one. This is number two. This is Ethereum. Ethereum is coming in just about $45 billion. But look at the chart. I can only draw one line on it. This is obviously a phase 1. But look at the dates. These are months: July, September, November 2017. We didn't get any price appreciation until March of last year. So there's no way this can be a hyperwave. We're only in phase 2. This has got a 1 in 4 chance of going on to be a hyperwave. That does not mean that Ethereum is not going to be a hyperwave. But I won't make that call until we get an acceleration of this line up to about double the angle, from below 45% to above 45%. We've got a bigger problem with Ethereum. That is, if it drops below this phase 2 line on a weekly closing basis, there is no phase 2 line. We don't even have a phase 2. We're going to go back to phase 1 and start all over or disappear. That's Ethereum. That's the number 2 crypto. Now, people sit back and they say, yeah, but look at this tremendous acceleration. That's called a bubble, folks. And a lot of things go into bubbles and pop and go back to zero. That's not what a hyperwave is. A hyperwave is in its own, in itself, changing the world to a major extent so that things will be different when it's over. Bitcoin is doing that. Maybe Ethereum will. Maybe the platform will work out. There's a lot of doubters on both sides. I'm just looking at the structure of hyperwaves. Okay, let's go on to the next one, which is, believe it or not, Ripple. Ripple is coming in right now at about $23 billion, about half of Ethereum, and 1/8 of Bitcoin. Once again, this does not take much explanation now that you know what goes into calling a hyperwave. This is a phase one, but it only lasts 3 months. Yes, there was a big acceleration up, but we're all the way back down here, and it sure looks like phase two, if this is phase two, and it's too early to even call this a phase two because we've only got one touch. Here's the beginning point. Now we've got a touch. If this is able to sustain itself the way we've seen phase three in Bitcoin, come back down a second time, a third time, a fourth time. Remember what we just looked at with Ethereum. Ethereum had several touches during this month of March, April, and May. Then it came back down and tested it again. Then it kind of came down and tested again. You can't see it on this chart, but there's a wick on this that comes all the way down to the phase line. And then it came close for 4 or 5 weeks in a row, but never got down to the line. That's good enough for me. Except this is just going from May to November of 1 year. Come back to me 2 years from now. And let's take a look and see if Ethereum continued to climb up a phase two line. Okay, Ripple, no comment. There's nothing here. Number 3. Now, when I say there's nothing here, let's be very clear. I'm not speaking as a maximalist. I'm speaking as a technical analyst who has developed a tool that can give you some great clues about a long period of time for major asset classes. I am not saying that any of these cryptos that we're looking at can't double, triple, quadruple, go up 100x over the next 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. That's not the point of what I'm talking about. The point is being very clear in our own minds when the term hyperwave is used, what it is talking about. You have to talk to other people or listen to me talk about the technicals of the crypto space, which I have not done yet, but I will, in terms of many, many other systems that help you determine what is the probable future of price. Different question. Okay, so this is now Bitcoin Cash. Once again, a little surprised that Bitcoin Cash has got almost $15 billion in it in terms of market cap, and no comment, there's nothing here from a hyperwave point of view. The next one, now we're getting into some interesting areas. This is Litecoin. The nice thing about Litecoin, it's been around a while, not a long while, but a while. I would say this is a very reasonable phase two because of all these touches along it. I would like, yeah, maybe. I was going to say I would like that to be a steeper angle, but that's not fair. I've seen plenty of hyperwaves with that kind of a phase two angle. Back here is a very short phase one, but okay. Big acceleration. Now, everybody's got to sort of answer this question for themselves. Why are we seeing all of the cryptos basically flat until October, November, December of 2017? Someone that didn't know these markets would probably say, well, because that's when Bitcoin went from 7,500 to 20,000. And I would find it difficult to argue with that. So you have to keep in mind that Bitcoin spawned all of these others. And therefore, investors in Bitcoin for the first 7 years, if they are trying to get in on a weak sister or a secondary or tertiary market that Bitcoin trailblazed, it makes economic sense not to pay $10,000 for a token if you can buy one for $50. If that $50 token can ride the coattails of the major asset class. And that would be one of my explanations why so many of these have done well, and now they are all doing very poorly. Okay, let's move on. I am not ready to draw a phase 3 here because this is not over with and we're coming close to phase 2. I'd love to see a touch here and then up, and then maybe for the rest of the year, and then up, and maybe for the rest of the year, before I'd be willing to call that a hyperwave. This is EOS, which comes in number 6 on the list at just about a little less than $5 billion. Same comments. This is Cardano, symbol ADA for whatever reason, also about $4 billion, no comment. This is Lumen, also called Stellar. Long period of time of not doing anything, and those that know Stellar or Lumen XLM can comment on what was going on there. I never followed it. So, but let's say that we've got a year-long phase 1 line. Okay, we can start looking for a phase 2. Okay, here's a break above the phase 1 line, but it came all the way back down to that line. And I think it would only be fair if this was 3 years long and not 18 months long to say phase 2 is down here below all of this price activity, which began in late spring, early summer of last year. That's what a phase 2 looks like, except it's not going anywhere. I have never seen a phase 2 that's flat. So I'm going to say that whatever was going on here, it had nothing to do with Hyperwave. I would say that this is probably a phase 2 that began with a real acceleration and a pullback to that line. And once again, it started the same time all the others started, when Bitcoin took off, actually from 3,000 up to 20,000, and pulled a lot of this stuff with it. Now they are being tested. Let's talk about it again a month from now and see how many of these break these, what we can call a phase 2, but we can't call a hyperwave until it goes into the next. See how many of them break down and go back to the beginning. And then we maybe will end up with 15 or 20 that actually go into hyperwaves, which will be exciting. But from where I sit, I wouldn't hold my breath. The next one is NEO, with about $3.7 billion in it. and no comment necessary. It looks identical to all the rest. The next one is IOTA or MIOTA, IOTA, same thing. And the last one I'm going to show you, because now we're down to about $3 billion. Remembering that the stocks we were looking at yesterday in the NASDAQ were between 100 billion and almost $1 trillion apiece. Individual companies that have 5 to 10 to 20 times the capitalization of the stocks we're looking at, or the cryptos we're looking at now. That is not a pejorative statement against the cryptos. This is a brand new asset class. It's going to take a lot of successes and failures to weed out strength from weakness. My whole point is, though, let's not use Hyperwave to do it. Hyperwave, to everything we've just looked at, is basically irrelevant, except the king, Bitcoin. That's why I'm taking all the time that Leah and I are spending talking about this in this space, because I'm so excited and intrigued of what Bitcoin is telling us about this entire crypto space. And with that, I'm going to go back to Leah.
Fabulous. Thank you, Tyler. More reverb. I don't know. I always get this.
Now,
No
we do want to talk about Bitcoin before we leave, but I just wanted to go back and see if you've got any questions or comments coming in that you think we need to address.
Currently, no questions. Guys, if you want to send through, let us know regarding specifically what we just talked about with hyperwaves and the altcoins. But I think onto the Bitcoin charts.
Okay, very good. I'm going to go back to screen share, because we all know that we are at a critical juncture with Bitcoin prices in terms of its phase 3 line. And since we've concluded that it's probably the only thing in the space that's actually in a hyperwave, let's see what we're talking about. This is the phase 3 line. I will quickly draw in a phase 2 line by eyeballing. Don't hold me to this one, but I just want to give you a little perspective. I'm going to put it about there. And now let's take a look at this. For a long time, I believed that we were in a 2, 3, 4, and when I was long this and had family members long this all the way up to 20,000, my feeling was that these building blocks had been going on for 10 years, and therefore I could make excuses for this very short phase 2 line and what would have turned out to be a very short phase 3 line. After I drew a phase 4 line up, and then unfortunately a phase 5 line and a phase 6 line, it was difficult not to conclude that this is phase 7 of a hyperwave. And I did conclude that. We sold all of our positions up between 14 and 17,000 based on my assumption that we had completed a hyperwave. maybe even just a fractal hyperwave that was then going to go back down and then start a monster back up, which is still a real possibility, as we've seen in the NASDAQ and the Dow and earlier in the 70s in gold. But since then, I keep saying that the best way for me to excuse the short phase 2 and phase 3 periods is to extend the phase 3 line. And I did that as we were coming down just to see what would happen. And what happened on February of this year, February the 4th, is we dropped below the line. And I said, okay, so that's the end of the phase 3 line. But by the close on Sunday, it had reversed and closed above it. And sometimes any trend line will do that. But that's very rare. That's very rare for a hyperwave line. Hyperwave lines, if they're valid, tend to be extremely resilient. So I began to think that this is still an active phase 3, and all of this is similar to what we looked at in the cryptos going above a phase 2 line. A tremendous explosion in price and then back to support to build support. I still believe that is the case because we've tested it again and again and again, and we are testing it this week. We are below it, but we've been below it before. I'm not going to conclude that phase 3 is broken until Sunday at 8 o'clock. If we're down below it, then so be it. We're going to come down to phase 2, and phase 2 will continue for a period of time before it can accelerate back up again. Okay, so what's the short term? That's the longer term. The short term is, and then we will conclude because we are running a lot longer than we wanted to, which I usually do. Not there, not there, not there. Where did it go? Yikes. Somebody stole my Bitcoin chart. Let's try that one. Okay. Here's where we are right now. We're at 79.09. We've got to be at 83.50 approximately. Sorry, I can't remember exactly the number I put down. The number I put down in my tweets and we talked about yesterday is correct. Whatever that number is, it's basically 135 points above last week, and last week was 82.60 approximately. So, and we'll keep going up at about 135 points a week. So this is the 4-hour chart for the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 candles. Last 24 hours, we've been going sideways. We tried to bounce up, got up to almost 8,200, then got driven back down again. There's a war going on. The bulls want to keep this as close to the hyperwave line as possible. The bears are trying to drive it down, and we'll just have to see what happens. Just one other note, and then I'm going to go, which is that the NASDAQ, which started out up 1%, is getting creamed again and is dropping rapidly. And we will have to see exactly how that closes and how close we're coming to the phase 4 line again, with all of its huge implications. Okay, enough of all of that. Thank you very much for listening to my explanation. And with that, we will say goodbye. Leah.
Bye, everybody. Definitely the hyperwave lines are proving to be very strong. We'll come again with another video tomorrow, but thanks. Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.